We are starting our seed saving workshop with our presenter Mayam Garris, who is going to go through the process of saving seeds with us. It is awesome property. So, yeah, want to show us
Yeah, we can.
the area?
So right now we're at the Gutierrez Hubble House for our folks who are tuning in online. Here in the South Valley of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I also want to acknowledge that we're on Isleta territory, and that's the context of the land that we're on. The land is still being farmed by folks from Isleta, and also acknowledging that there are folks who aren't removed, that there are people still continuing living and thriving and growing on these lands. So just bringing that into the context of the space. The Gutierrez Hubble House is owned by Bernalillo County Open Space. They purchased this land, I believe, back in 2017 and restored it into agricultural growing space. So that's what I do as a farmer here. On my second year as an incubator with Gutierrez Hubble House, and the program is called Grow the Growers, where essentially they're training folks how to grow and cultivate crops here in the South Valley. So we're actually going to walk further down this way, and I'll begin kind of my presentation about growing and saving seeds. So first, I just want to express my gratitude to Cateri, to Emma, to Jose, Center of Southwest Culture, the folks who tapped my shoulder back in July and said, hey, let's put on a workshop together about saving seed. I'm just really grateful for the fact that we can all share space together, as well as with the attendees here and the people online. I'm just really grateful that we can have this opportunity to really just learn and grow with one another. Yeah, and I also want to give gratitude and thanks to my teachers who taught me and are still teaching me. It's not done. I haven't finished learning any of this at all. I'm always learning. So the folks I really want to uplift is my grandmother and my grandfather, Barbara Jean Garris and Charles Ray Garris. They're growers and land stewards back in North Carolina, which is my home place, one of my many home places, and it's Catawba territory for those who are interested in the indigenous language and name of the space. They're the ones who taught me everything I know about growing, as well as the plants. They're always teaching me every single time I interact with them. They're the ones who remind me that, hey, there's this difference here. There's this nuance here. Our season teaches us that as well. So I'm always learning in constant relationship with that too. So yeah, I also want to acknowledge, that we all have wisdom too in some way, in some capacity, when it comes to either maybe growing relationship with one another, or growing plants, or our relationship to water. So I also want to honor that, that I'm learning with y'all, we're learning together. So I'm also really, really open and inspired to kind of hear from y'all and engage with y'all. Our listeners too, if there's anything that y'all want to share, if there's a chat function or anything like that, I'm always open to just get questions, or if there's even anything after the live recording too that people want to ask, open to that as well. So yeah, we're all here to kind of talk about saving seed. We all have our wisdom and our knowledge and that relationship that we have built with the plant to be able to cultivate that plant for seed, right? So kind of why would we save seed? Why do it? And anyone can answer before I start running my mouth.
It adapted to that specific climate or ecosystem, and you're back on that land and that soil.
Mm-hmm. So adaptation, we're saving seed for adaptation to specific climates and regions. That's a really good answer from our attendee Anna here. I also want to acknowledge too that saving seed is a cultural practice, is an indigenous practice. It's something that we wouldn't be here today if people didn't save seed, didn't keep seed. We would have died thousands, if not millions, of years ago. So also honoring the legacy and roots of indigenous seed savers, keepers, and sharers. So one of the common examples is Teosinte, which is one of the original formations of corn. And it was a kernel that was super hard, not really edible, but there's a lot of indigenous communities that saw that there was potential in this plant and cultivated it to be what maize, or what we call corn today. So that's just one example of seed keeping. In today's context, it saves money. Because let's be honest, as farmers, as growers, it's hard to make a living. So it cuts down on costs and expenses too. Since pandemic, since COVID, there's been an increase in cost of seed, and with that, increase the cost of shipping of seed too. So if you're growing it locally, you're cutting back on your expenses of potentially purchasing seed that year or getting it shipped and delivered to you from maybe a place that's not as culturally and climately unique as New Mexico. Another cool thing about saving seed is you're a part of the whole entire life cycle of a plant. So you're building that relationship with that intimacy with the plant too. And I think that's a beautiful experience that we can have, is like realizing that, we're not just harvesting it and that's it. There's another process too, of witnessing the growth, the birth of a plant, and then also, when a plant's going to seed, honoring, that it's going to die too. And how that's also a very important process of life in general, is that process of death, but then also continuing even beyond death. We're not trying to get all philosophical about it, but also just realizing, plants kind of teach us that every single day, about the cycle of life too. So Anna had mentioned, that we're growing adapted seed, right? There's one thing to get a seed from maybe a seed company in, Wisconsin or in Maine. When you try to plant that seed here, it may live, but more likely it might struggle a lot too, because it's not used to this climate that we have. So when you're keeping seeds that are regionally grown, we're growing seeds that are adapting with our climate, that are adapting with the shift in the weather, or adapting to maybe this apocalyptic world that we may be reaching too. I think seed keeping is going to be the way of the future. I mean, it's been that way. But it's going to definitely sustain us as, it gets hotter and drier here. Having seeds that are used to that climate will keep us alive as we move into this kind of uncertain and unknown territory. Because those seeds, they really carry memory. They carry that memory of like the things that they went through. If there's insect damage, if there's lack of water, if there's a hailstorm, there's a frost, that it somehow still survived and has that memory. So, another thing that I learned while listening to a podcast that was very interesting about seed saving is, we're preserving biodiversity in a seed. A lot of seed companies kind of like have this one specific type of seed that, it's just grown to do one certain thing. So produce as many kernels as corn as possible, or produce this certain uniform chili that will remain the same. And when we're keeping seeds that are, amongst different kind of species and life cycles of different plants, they also maintain that genetic diversity too. So that's something that I'll maybe touch on a little bit later, but it's very unique, because a lot of things that we're seeing now is like this narrowing of a window in biodiversity, right? So you only have a yellow potato, you only have a white potato, you have a red potato, that's it. But a good example is in Peru, there's like 300 different species of potatoes that are green, that are purple. I don't even know, maybe all these different colors, right? But also have that different memory too. So preserving the biodiversity of the seed. And another thing too, before we start to move on, is ensuring food security, right? So when we're saving a seed and we're doing it on a community level and more than just an individual level, we're also ensuring that, that we're fed, that we're maintained, that we're whole, and that we're able to really thrive as a community. One thing about seed keeping is not an individual person's like job. if we think about it historically, it's a community effort to keep a seed, right? And then more folks that are growing it, that means they're also able to sustain ourselves as groups of individuals, right? Another thing too is like when you grow something for seed, I don't know if y'all have seen this, but for example, if you cut open a chili seed or a chili plant, there's like hundreds of seeds in there, right? And that means if you keep 5 of those, that's 500 seed. So are you going to have space to grow that 500 seed? Maybe. But if you don't, then you can share that with your community, and then now we're growing those 500 seeds instead of one person too. So it's ensuring that that we are able to meet the needs of our community and of each other too. So yeah, we can continue to walk down because it's nice to walk and talk. I think another thing too, on top of just growing food in community, is also the food security aspect of it too. So not only knowing that we're going to be fed, but in case the supply chain does break down, meaning that we're no longer able to get fresh produce from California or from these like places that are able to grow food year long, that we're able to then ensure that we're still fed and taken care of. So it's almost like this insurance in a way. When we're keeping seed, is we're also making sure that in case things do go south, in case things do go bad, we're taken care of because those seeds are adapted to this region. Where we're able to basically throughout the summer plant seeds, cultivate them, grow together, and then we actually have the opportunity to mark some plants to keep for seed as well. So that's the educational component of also growing food together and growing food for seed, is including and involving our youth in that process too. So we're training our future generations to continue the seed keeping legacy as well. So as I was sharing before, this is the student solidarity plot. This is a plot that youth from Rio Grande High School and youth from Polk Middle School got together and to cultivate a space to learn how to grow food with one another for 7 weeks over the summer. And we grew all sorts of things in this space, including chiles. There's leeks. There's tulsi basil over there. And then also we have our herbal garden bed here. And then just on this side over here is all white corn from Zuni Pueblo that we received from one of the trainers here. His name is Cancho, and he's from Zuni. And he gifted us the seed that, it's a funny story that he was telling me that he was cleaning out the space of an elder, and the way that the elder compensated him was by giving him corn seed. And then he shared it with us this year. So this is the space here. This is also a space where we learned how to grow food not only for edible purposes, but also for seed. One way that we did it was by tagging them with a white string here. And it's so funny, it looks like one of the insects really loved this plant and started to munch on it. But one of the things that we did was mark a plant for seed. And the reason why we did that was to know what do we see about the plant that maybe we would want to keep it for, so the characteristics of it. So one thing that we noticed was with this chili in particular, that it had a bunch of fruit on it at the time. The fruit was nice and heavy and big, and it also had a lot of leaves as well. So I can kind of talk about the planning aspect around seed saving, and we'll kind of get into the logistics around it. So choosing a location is super important because that's going to be like where you plant things. And it doesn't really matter the size of the space, just as long as you have a space to plant. And then also choosing a variety. So like knowing where your seed comes from. So again, like I touched on, it's different to maybe purchase seed from Maine as opposed to maybe purchasing seed from your neighbor or from a seed company here in the Southwest. And the more regionally acclimated you are, is more better for you to get those seeds. Also, how many seeds do you start with? Just knowing that amount, and it usually says it on the packet. And this is important because say you start with 25 seed, and then you get 500 seed in return, then you know the improvement and the amount of yield that you got per plant too. Say you started with 25 seed and you got 50 seed, you want to grow that seed again. So just really like knowing how much you start with and then knowing how much you end with informs like your success rate in seed saving and seed keeping. Another thing too is just like even marking your plot. So at the beginning of each row here in the solidarity plot, we kind of marked what was growing where, and that'll kind of help with confusion as well as knowing how many plant space per feet and things like that. Labeling your row with your name, the variety of the plant, and then when you planted it. And this is important just because it kind of just helps you keep things logistically. And you would think like, hey, as a seed keeper, I'm just going to throw it in the ground and see what comes up. And that's one way of doing it. But I think also just knowing and like keeping that intimate relationship with your plant is super important as well. Also knowing the length of growth to maturity, and I'll talk about annual and biannual. And that's how long the plants will stay in your space. So that will kind of also inform your crop rotation too. Because when you're growing something for seed, again, you're going to be with that plant during the entire life cycle. So it'll be helpful to know that. So if you're growing, for example, collard greens for seed, that's going to be in the ground for 2 years as opposed to maybe chili for seed that'll be in the ground for 1 year. So that will inform, you know, how long something's going to be in the bed. And that'll kind of help with clarity around just data keeping and record keeping, as well as just also knowing that if you're going to get something for true seed as opposed to false seed, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this means that you have to have a journal, or like we also have our phones too. But record keeping is super important for seed distribution and sharing. And for me, that kind of teaches on ethics a little bit. Because say, for example, you grow something for seed and it's not true seed. Like, for example, this carrot here. It is going to flower and going to seed, but it actually takes carrots 2 years to actually go to seed. So if I were to harvest this and then share it with community, it's actually not going to be a true carrot seed. And then someone would be like, hey, you gave me carrot seed and none of it grew. Like, what's going on? Well, it's because I knew that, you know, it actually takes 2 years for this to go to seed. And I'm not necessarily a liar, but like I ended up like being dishonest with that person because I gave them something that actually wasn't a true seed. So record keeping is really important, just to know with yourself, like what you're growing, and then also if you're sharing it with others, just like being honest in that process as well.
So when you say 2 years, you're not leaving it for those 2, or you are leaving that specific one for those 2 years, like even through the winter?
Correct. Yes. You leave it throughout the winter. For a biannual seed, you would leave it throughout the winter, and then it would go to seed again in the springtime. And I actually had some carrot seeds that ended up doing that this year that were harvested, but I guess we missed a couple. But they went to flower and seed this year, and I was able to collect it and share it. And I knew it was true seed because, funny story is, it rained one day. The wind blew the carrot seeds off my front table, and now they're germinating too. So knowing, you know, that it's true seed because, you know, they'll grow. So that's one thing. Another thing, as far as like journaling, I try to journal weekly if I can, just to maintain that intimacy with the plant. It doesn't have to be weekly. Bi-weekly or monthly is fine too. But at least just taking note of what's happening. Like, is there insect damage? Like with this didn't happen. This wasn't like this on Thursday, right? So just noticing if there's insect damage, how much water you're getting, how hot it is outside. You know, was there a frost? Was there a hailstorm? Was there any sort of damage that happened? For example, with these chilies, we planted them, I want to say May 12th, and then a frost came through the next day and like wiped out a bunch of plants around this area. These plants looked super sad the next day. but then we got some rain in June, and now they've perked up, right? So knowing like what these plants withstand, so then when you make a note about it later on, you're not just planting something that, you know, oh, like I planted it and everything was fine. Like I knew that they withstood frost, they withstood hail, they withstood insect damage. And all that's important when you share that with others, as well as like when you're planting them next year as well. Another important thing too is to look at the species of a plant, because they may cross if plants are in the same family. So a good common example is planting melons and cantaloupe, or watermelon and cantaloupe, right? If you plant those next to each other, they'll cross, right? So then when you harvest it and you're like, why does this taste all funny and weird? It's maybe because the watermelon genetics and the cantaloupe genetics mixed, and now you have a cantamelon or something like that. So isolating varieties is important, just because if you're wanting to share things or get true seed, you want to make sure you have something that is true to its nature. Another great example of that too is, for example, if you're growing corn, coordinating that with your fellow growers too, and we did that here, where if you look off into the distance where that giant mammoth corn is, that was planted first, and then the student solidarity corn was planted second, and then I ended up planting corn last. And that was all due to the fact that we didn't want different varieties of corn to cross, because sometimes you want to have blue corn, for example, and you don't want it to cross with the white corn. So just like communicating with your growers, with your neighbors if you can. And hey, maybe that also builds a relationship between yourself and other members as well. And I'm also going to say something that's pretty contradictory. Another cool thing about seed saving and seed keeping is there's a lot of relatives of plants that are wild. A good example is sunflowers. Another good example is amaranth. So for example, you could grow red amaranth, and then there's the pigweed or the spiky amaranth that everyone dislikes, that gives us all allergies and makes us like really mad around the fall time. I did this thing at a farm that I'm growing at where I actually left some amaranth, some cultivated amaranth, next to pigweed, and people are like, why would you do that? That's ridiculous. Like you get allergies and it's just horrible to do that. Well, if you think about those wilder species of amaranth, they have withstood getting mowed, weed whacked, hoed, like stepped on, trampled on, just like ultimately just like disregarded, right? And they'll still go to seed. And then if you have that next to something that you're cultivating, that you're taking good care of and weeding around, the genetics of that amaranth, that wild amaranth, and your cultivated amaranth will cross. And sure, you may get some red amaranth that has like green leaves, or maybe have a spiky seed head, but also the memory of that amaranth that was just beaten up will cross with the ones that you've taken good care of, and then you have that resilient seed that will maybe withstand getting attacked and mowed and just like beaten up too. So that's something that is a little contradictory, but I also wanted to highlight too, that our wild plant relatives, they've been through so much, you know, they've been so much through the years, and then also throughout the growing season too. And it's good to just leave a couple, you know, maybe not have them take over your whole space, but leave a couple, because you never know what you get when they do cross. A good example is I had some single head sunflowers cross with some of these wild sunflowers now, and now I have at my home garden space big stalked single head sunflowers that have multiple branches now because they cross with the wild ones. So it's fun to just kind of like experiment and let that happen, and also remember that, you know, these wild plants are here for a reason. They've been here, and let's continue to keep them, because who knows, maybe they may save us in the future too. So yeah. So we will head out of the student solidarity plot, and we will head to the plot that I am cultivating. This is the space that I'm cultivating. This is all blue corn. I had a lot of help planting this space with Yuri, Holden, some other just beautiful community members that came through and helped me plant. This space, this is 1/8 of an acre of blue corn. And it was planted in June, mid-June. So again, talking about the communication between plantings with corn and community members, making sure that we space our windows correctly so that we don't get crosses. There's also beans on some of these plants, so 6 rows of dry beans growing with the corn. And I was motivated by youth from Rio Grande High School who wanted to learn how to plant, the 3 sisters, and just plant with one another. And I was like, gosh, I don't want to do beans. This is going to be a big space full of beans. But they were the ones that really inspired me to grow the beans with the corn, and also just see the relationship between the two. So I just wanted to kind of ground us in just the amount of energy that it took to cultivate this. And also give a lot of gratitude and thanks to the folks who are here, as well as the folks who aren't present that helped me grow this space, because there's no way I could have done this alone. So that brings me to the topic of monitoring. And again, I want to really, really uplift record keeping, journaling. As tedious as it is, it really helps us in the future so we know what we're getting into going on. So for me, when it comes to seed keeping and saving, I like to tag my plants. In tagging, I simply use this neon pink tape here, or we could use that white string as well. And usually when I tag a plant, I do it because that's what I want to save for seed. So for corn, for example, and I guess this was the one. I look down the row and I'm like, okay, so what am I seeing? I'm seeing a bunch of ears here of different sizes, right? And there are some that are like medium, some that haven't filled out all the way, and then there are some that are just massive, right? And with corn, I usually try to look at the overall health of the plant and not just the ears, because that's really what matters. And then that helps me decide, how I want to save it. And then simply what I'll do is I'll be like, okay, so this is the one I want to save for seed, and I'll just tie it off here. And this lets me know that when I come by, like, this is the one I'm going to keep for seed, and not necessarily use for eating at all. With corn, I've been instructed by an elder, and this is really, really sweet that they shared this with me, that you always want to save, if you can, try to save corn seed that's more so in the middle, because all the ones in the outside of your corn plot may get pollinated by different other corn, but the ones in the middle will more so cross with each other and not cross with other corn outside. So I'm really grateful to that elder sharing that with me, because as a seed keeper, that's really important. I'll know I'll get more true seed here in the middle, so I'll be more so likely to mark plants here in the middle as opposed to outside the space. Let me see if I can find it. A good rule of thumb with saving seed is you usually want to save seed from like 4 different plants. I just like the number 4. For me, that means completion. But you wouldn't want to save seed from one plant, because if you do that, it only has the memory of that one plant. If you save it from 4 or more, it has 4 different memories, 4 different experiences, and that kind of helps with genetic diversity of a plant. If you do save seed from one plant, that's great, but just know in the future, when you keep planting those seeds, the genetic diversity window just keeps getting narrow and narrow and narrow, and then you may end up with, I don't know, corn that is like all gnarly and just like really just isn't healthy, right? It may be stunted and may be unhealthy in some way because it only has that one small genetic window. So that's just something to keep in mind. 4 or more is always a good rule of thumb to go with. If you can't get that, maybe just try again. Maybe purchase more seed and try again with what you have saved. just because you saved one seed from one plant doesn't mean that's it. It just means that, maybe try again with more options.
Where was this seed acclimated?
So this seed actually came from Green Tractor Farm from La Cienega, New Mexico. And I had a friend of mine, Leanna, who provided this seed for me because they knew I wanted to grow a bunch of blue corn this year. And I can kind of nerd out a little bit about how it was planted. So knowing that we're entering into heavier and heavier drought, this space was originally on flood irrigation, but I wanted to put down drip line here just in case the flood was cut off early. And then I also planted it into depressions this year as opposed to on the raised beds, because my hope was during monsoon season that when it would rain, all the water would collect into the depressions as opposed to just on top, where sure it would infiltrate, but it may just splatter and hit off the ground. So this really helped with water sequestration, or keeping water and having it really percolate into the ground. And I would actually test the soil during monsoon season, and this would remain way more wetter in these depressions as opposed to on top of the mounds. So switching, I planted in the walkways this year because these are our walkways, as opposed to like in the raised beds. And I also cover cropped this space last year to get it ready for corn planting this year. So yeah, I've talked about kind of crossing experimentation and harvest. So yeah, usually we live in such a beautiful, beautiful environment to where a lot of the things that you can harvest for seed will naturally like dry on the plant. Me coming from North Carolina, it was really hard for me to keep seed because I would have to harvest it before the raining season would come. Otherwise it would just mold on the plant. And then the next thing too is like having to have a dry room, a room specifically dedicated to drying seed, because even if you're trying to dry something in North Carolina, it could still potentially mold because there's just so much humidity in the environment that you didn't even have a space where you could keep seeds. So thankfully for a lot of us who do live in the Southwest, we have this wonderful and beautiful opportunity to just let seed dry. So that's what I'm doing with the corn and the beans. I've actually cut off the irrigation to let these plants naturally start to dry on their own. So if we're trying to dry seed that's not on the plant, I usually use paper bags here. And a lot of times is I'll collect the seed and then I'll either cut the paper bags open and lay it flat on the surface and let it dry. Drying racks are also really good too. It's literally just like wood with mesh, like you'd see like on a screen door or something like that. And that will allow for a bit more airflow above the seed and also below the seed too. And that's more preferred. But if we don't have access to that, paper bags are just as great. And that really helps out a lot. Also, sometimes I do this thing, and my neighbors ask me this every year. If I'm saving sunflower seed or corn seed, I'll put a paper bag like right on top of it. And then specifically with corn or sunflowers, I do this because the birds, they'll be the first ones to let you know that the seed is ready. So I want to protect that seed from the bird, and they will get their fair share. I always leave some for our animal relatives. But if there's something that I like this year I had a double-headed sunflower on both sides, I put a bag over it because I wanted to keep that one. So usually a paper bag is great. I don't do plastic just because plastic keeps humidity, and then the seed will just literally mold inside the plastic. So paper bag is our best method. Mesh is also great too if we have access to it. But if we don't, paper bag. Got this from the dollar store. You can get it from grocery stores because a lot of grocery stores are going to paper bags now. So I like to use paper bags for harvesting and seed keeping too. As far as like materials you use to actually like dry the seed, a drying rack if you can afford it. Paper is also great. Having a fan also helps with the airflow too, and also helps with the drying process. because you're just blowing dry air onto the seed, so it kind of speeds it up a little bit. I like to have markers just to know what I'm saving seed of. So just like marking it on the paper, like, hey, this is letter chili. So like having that. And then at the end, having like envelopes. Paper envelopes are always great. So then you can keep it and store it and have it marked in something that is also natural. And then you can also send it out too. So post-harvest handling, again, like I spoke about earlier, weighing how much you got at the end of the season. So if you started off with a pound of seed or 25 seeds, like weigh how much you received at the end. And then ask the question, like, how many did I start with? How many do I have now? And then would I grow this again? Seeds store best if they're kept in a cool and dry, dimly lit, dark place. So I personally like to keep them in my living room where it's like pretty cold in there. I just put like a blanket over top of the seeds that keep the light out. I saw a friend who they kept seeds in a mason jar, and they just put black tape around the mason jar to kind of simulate that darkness as well. If their seeds are exposed to light, it's almost like that reminder and the idea of like, hey, like it's time to start growing again. And if you have that happening in the wintertime, you're just tricking your seeds to think that it's spring or summer and it's time to start growing.
What if they're in an envelope? Like they're still getting through the envelope, like
right.
sunlight. So you want that envelope in a
correct. Yeah,
dark area.
Right, and sometimes, so that's when I just took like a dark bed sheet I got from like Savers or whatever, and I just put it like, I have a shelf with all my envelopes on it, and I just put it over the shelf, so it's still like dark. So like just ways of like really trying to like remind them that, hey, it's dormancy time, and once it's time to plant you, I'll put you outside and start getting that process going. So that was a really good question. And yeah, another thing too, if the seeds do start to mold, don't freak out. It's okay. Just maybe wash them a little bit, get that mold off. And then some say like you could put a little bit of bleach water just to kill the mold. It's up to you ethically if you want to do that or not. But just wash them, allow them to dry outside. I usually put them outside for like a day, like a whole day, and then at night I'll bring them back in, and then I'll air dry them after that inside, and then I'll put them back in the envelope or the mason jar, and then hopefully they won't mold again. Another thing too is seeds love to be shared because they give so much. So feel free and be ready to share your seeds. Because like I said, imagine if I grew all this from seed, I am not going to have enough space to grow maybe 5,000 kernels of corn. So be ready to share them because they want that. You know, that's what they're here for. Not only to be eaten, but to be distributed as well. Or be ready to grow more. Be ready to take on that responsibility of more space, because that's what you're going to get. I think I started off, for example, with these beans. I started off with a packet of 25, and I still have a lot of Zuni Gold beans, and it was enough to really take up this whole row, and then still have more left over too. So over the winter time, I love to share seeds with people. I feel like that's the time to do it. So yeah. So I think we can head into the shade now, and I can talk about different types of seeds. Yeah. Folks want to sit down, feel free. I'm going to take a load off. So this is going to be like a lot of, I feel like maybe this is already a lot of information. But this will be like more like technical, like, information. I'm also happy to share notes too, like if it's just like a lot. But I'm just going to talk about different types of seed, just because I feel like this is important as far as just like knowing what you're growing. So there's slips, which are like for example, sweet potatoes are a slip. Your sweet potato, you'll put it underground and you'll water it, and then these little greens will come up. And each of those greens is a slip. So then come planting time, you would harvest the slip of the green, and then you can put it in the ground, water it, and that'll make new sweet potatoes. So yeah, that's usually how people will grow sweet potatoes. I also have like a funny life hack. If people are strapped for cash and don't want to buy seed packets, naturally, or you can usually go to like an organic store and get like food in bulk, right? So like for example, here in Albuquerque, we have La Montanita Co-op, and they usually have like bulk beans or bulk corn or bulk quinoa or whatever. They also have organic produce too. If you buy organic, that means that they haven't been treated with any pesticide, but that also means that then you can plant whatever you buy from an organic store too. So that can also save you a lot of money in the end too, because sweet potato slips are expensive. 25 beans are super expensive. If you get a bulk amount of seeds, you're saving a lot of that money too. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
I heard, especially with potatoes, that some of them, it's also, even if it's organic, it could have been treated with pesticides, but organic.
Mm-hmm.
Pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that they also won't reproduce. Is that a thing that some of those seeds are planted so that they don't continue reproducing? So I would
Right.
be able to save seeds. Is that a thing?
Yeah, so sometimes, depending on how it's...
Would you mind repeating that question?
Yeah, so Yuri had asked, sometimes if you buy organic, they're treated with either organic pesticides or they're treated with some sort of spray they basically sterilize the plants. They sterilize the seed. So that's always a big caveat. Another thing I like to do to kind of know if it will reproduce is, for example, with potatoes, they'll create those like little eyes. And there's a way to kind of stimulate that where if you just put them in a paper bag, they're basically making the potato decompose, right? So during that decomposition process, they'll create those eyes. So that's a good way to check, is to at least be like, okay, I'm not going to eat these. I'm just going to let them rot in this paper bag. And if they start making those eyes, that's how you know they're not sterilized. So then make seed. So there's a way to kind of like trick that process, or at least find out. Does that answer your question? Yeah. No, thank you for asking, because there's so many things about seed keeping and topics around that. So on the topic of potatoes, those are more so like clones. So potatoes don't necessarily, they can make seed, but very rarely they do. People usually clone them. And commonly cloned plants are like potatoes, strawberries, cannabis. A lot of people clone cannabis, dahlias, irises, like tubers and things like that. And people usually will propagate those seeds or propagate those plants. Another seed type is grain. So like barley, rye, amaranth, quinoa. I have arguments with myself daily about if corn's a grain or not. And then we have true seed versus false seed. And that was again talking about are plants annual or biannual. So the carrot example was one. Another biannual plants are beets, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, celery, chard, collard greens, and kale. Onions are also biannual. And turnips are also biannual. So biannual means it has a life cycle of every 2 years. So the first year is spent a lot on the roots and the leaves, and then the second year is spent on making the flower and the seed. Annual plants are plants that are just one and done. Like a sunflower, it grows, makes a flower, makes a seed in 1 year, and that's it. So those are the difference between biannuals and annuals. And it's really important to know with seed saving.
borage?
Yeah. So borage is like an
Sorry,
annual.
which one?
Oh, yes. So is there a category of plants that drop seed every year and reproduce? Is that the question? Yeah. So the question, and those are usually annual seeds. And those are like a lot of herbs, like borage, for example. Cilantro is another good common example. Peppers are a good example. Tomatoes. And let me see, amaranth. Yeah, there's a lot. Even lettuce, for example. Lettuce, melons, peas, cucumbers, a lot of flowers here and there are all really good examples of annual seeds.
Cucumbers, what is like, or like, okay, any kind of mucusy, like say okra, cucumber, squash. What is the best way to like dry those so that you can save them? Because
Yeah. No, you actually are helping me segue into my next.
Oh,
That's
okay.
great. No, I'm into it. So yeah. So Anna had asked, what's the difference between like basically seeds that would need to dry as opposed to seeds that need to ferment. And tomatoes or cucumbers are seeds that need to ferment. And if you think about it, fermenting is what they would naturally do. So a tomato will grow, right? And then after a while, it'll get really plump and either split and crack and then like fall off the ground. And then in its natural process, it will just rot. And then over winter time, it would rot. And then springtime, whenever it's time for it to reemerge, then it would regrow, right? And that's the fermentation process. But I mean, a lot of times we don't want our plants to do that, right? We want to maybe eat that tomato, right? But it still has its seeds in there. So what you would do with tomatoes, and it's so funny, I'm not a tomato grower because I'm allergic, but I had to do my research. And essentially what you would do is you would harvest that tomato and then cut it up, separate the seed, and you would let it ferment in its pulp. And then after it ferments, then you would lay it out on a paper towel and let it dry. Same thing with cucumbers. You actually would wait until the cucumbers like pass prime. So to the point where if you're growing a cucumber and it's green, you would actually let it turn yellow, and it would be nasty. I probably wouldn't eat it, but you would also have to let it ferment as well and then let it dry, and then you would get true seed from there. Cucumber and it's green, usually the seeds are like super small. They're not ripe. They actually haven't fully developed yet. So you want the fruit to completely develop. So with a cucumber, when it's actually developing, we eat it green because it's immature. So when it turns yellow, that's actually when it starts to mature. And it's not edible for us, but then the seeds have had that chance to develop inside. And then that's when you cut it open, compost the flesh, and then let the seeds ferment in the pulp. And then you just strain it from the pulp, put it on a paper towel, and let it dry.
What's the specific one in Chile where it's red, it's fermenting, and then it's drying on the vine?
Yes. Yeah, so the question is, do you let the plant dry on the vine as opposed to harvesting it and then letting it dry?
or to mature. I think right. That's what you're asking. The cucumbers.
Mm-hmm.
Would you let it get yellow on the vine?
Correct. Yeah. So with that, I would let it get yellow on the vine, or with chiles, I would let them turn red on the vine. Because if you think about it, that fruit is connected to the whole life cycle of the plant, right? So to the leaves, to the stem, to the roots, to everything. So if you cut that off, then you cut off that energy from the seed. But what you want is that full life cycle capacity energy from the root to the stem to the leaves to the seed. So the best thing to do is actually let it ferment on the vine, let it dry on the vine. So then you're getting that full potential. Because what can end up happening is, say, like I've actually had this happen in my house where I harvest a Chile green and it turns red in my house, right? But I'm unsure about planting those seeds because I don't know if that full energetic exchange was there. from the plant, from the original plant. So the best thing to do is just let it go through its full life cycle on the plant. So then you can take it off and then let it dry. Like usually the seeds that are viable will sink to the bottom of a jar or some sort of container, and the non-viable ones will float to the top. And the reason why that is because if you think about it, something light floats, right? But if it's dense, it sinks, which means like the lighter seeds usually don't have all of the density that a more mature, like more processed seed would have. So it's basically like an empty shell at the top. So you want more of the full life, vibrant seeds that are at the bottom of that container, because those are the ones that have all that energy stored in them. So I want to find out with cucumbers. I personally haven't let a cucumber go to full maturity because I just love them so much. And then I haven't saved tomato seeds because I am allergic to tomatoes. They'll make me gag if I smell them like rotting. That's just my allergic reaction, so I don't have experience saving tomato seeds. Thanks for asking. Yeah. We're a group dedicated to seed saving and sharing knowledge around saving seeds. So there's the Grassroots Seed Network. So it's grassrootsseednetwork.org. And that's a group, a radical organization that's dedicated to sharing info around seeds, as well as potentially sharing seeds with one another too. Locally here in Albuquerque, I want to lift up Space Dog Seeds. That's a rad farmer in the North Valley in Albuquerque that is growing seeds. I actually received a lot of seeds. His name's Andy. Turn out Andy. I received a lot of wildflower seeds from Andy that have just done really great this year. So that's a local grower that is really smart and knowledgeable and dedicated to growing seeds. There's also Chispas Farm, Casey, who is really, really generous in sharing their wisdom and info around seeds and sharing seeds. So that's another farmer as well. I don't know if there are more networks. There's the Rio Grande Grain collective or cooperative too. And I know they're more geared towards growing like grains. But they also have a lot of information around that too. And I'm sure New Mexico State Extension Office also has information around. So the question was, is there a local indigenous seed bank? I personally haven't interacted with folks about that. But I know a friend named Loba who lives in Moriarty, New Mexico, who interacts with a local indigenous seed bank on that side of the mountain. I have intentions around doing that. Right now, my relationship has just been with individuals, not like groups of people. But no, that's a really good question about that. Yeah. You can cold stratify a seed, which essentially is like, there's a lot of seeds that like to go through the winter and then emerge in the spring. A common example is garlic. So you plant garlic either prior to the winter or during the winter time. And it goes through this process of being like, oh, okay, like it's winter. I'm getting and receiving the information that I need, so now I can emerge in the springtime. So that's called cold stratification. There's scarification, and those are for seeds that have like a heavy coat. So for example, okra is one. So you just slightly scratch that seed, and it breaks that outer shell to then let the seed know on the inside that it's time to emerge, and it kind of just helps them break through that outer coating. You would do that with okra as opposed to maybe like a lettuce seed, because lettuce seed is super light, it's easy to germinate, and you don't have to scratch it because you'd probably just break it. And then there's overwintering, so that's also like kind of similar to garlic. A lot of wildflowers like to overwinter. A lot of grain like rye or barley will overwinter. Oats will overwinter, and vetch. And you would plant that early to late fall, and then the plants will go dormant over the winter time and then reemerge in the spring. And that's really great for cover cropping or just getting the ground prepped and started. That also saves you a lot of labor too if you're breaking new ground. It's just to plant cover crop to have those seeds overwinter and reemerge. And then there's soaking seeds, which is really great for our climate, and great for seeds that have like a bigger density. And then it's basically how it sounds. You would soak them in water, and then let them dry. So typically what I like to do is I'll soak them overnight. So say I'm going to plant on Wednesday, for example. I'll soak them on Monday, take them out of the water on Tuesday, let them dry, and then plant them on Wednesday. And there's also monsoon planting, and those are plants that will come up during the rainy season. Amaranth is a really good example. Some beans, melons, and sunflowers are great. Jesus shared with me about how great his sunflowers did over the monsoon season, and that's because plants have different adaptations and things that they like. So that's another thing. And then I also want to share with y'all quickly undersowing. And that's sowing seeds underneath the story of taller plants. And it's great for fall plantings or for the spring or summer into the... So that's all I got. Thanks y'all for hearing me run my mouth for an hour and a half. I'm glad that we got to share space with one another, and I'm also here for questions, either online or in person, if there are any other questions at this time.
Thank you, Mayam.
Yeah. I was hoping that we could process some seed, but I know it's 11:30, so yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody for coming out today, and thank you so much, Mayam, for sharing all of this amazing wisdom. I definitely learned a lot, even just sitting here for a few minutes. So yeah, I just really appreciate it, and I welcome everybody to continue to reach out, not only to the Center of Southwest Culture, but to Mayam as well. And there's some more resources that they were able to provide for us. So to take home, and just thank you.